consultant to the JUST Association, JASS, an international feminist movement based in Washington, D.C., and is also a consultant to the Nobel Women's Initiative, a feminist organization of women who have won the Nobel Peace Prize. Let's welcome Laura Carlsen.
So many of you know the Americas program. We've been based in Mexico City since 2003, and I'll leave some cards here because a lot of the material and articles that describe more a little bit what I'm going to talk about are on that website. We've been following gender issues for quite a while and put a lot of attention into that. Which, let's see, can anyone put these slides up for me? You know, this is called Women Moving Beyond Capitalism. So you kind of get an impression like capitalism is here and women are moving beyond or something. And while it's true that in many cases women are in the vanguard of moving beyond capitalism, what we really see in most of the experiences that I'll talk about are women pushing history beyond capitalism. It's not like they're going by themselves, you know, beyond someplace where we're at, but just the way that they're pushing this whole, their communities, their families, their societies in ways that go beyond capitalism. Now, I've got these slides because I had some of them in Spanish, and because I thought I could cover all bases. Of course, we've got an English-speaking audience, but these slides are in Spanish, so I'll just be going through them. Let's see, so you can go to the next one.
Do you want me to do it?
Or, I don't care. Okay. Yeah, go ahead. You can just, you know, oh yeah, this is just a picture. So I wanted to start, well, this is a picture of women in Chiapas that Dawn was talking about. It's one of the most important experiences we have, particularly in the line of autonomy. Given the difference that Gustavo was talking about yesterday, where we have simultaneous processes of building spaces that are never outside the system, because the system is pretty all-inclusive in terms of how it touches people, but that are building, but have significant forms of self-government in which gender is major. We've seen many, this is probably the Zapatistas are one of the most important, but we've been seeing processes throughout the region that I specialize in, which is the Americas, and particularly in terms of the gender work, Mesoamerica, that is to say, Mexico and Central America, where feminist organizations and women's groups have been very firm in saying there will be no revolution without us. This is not going to be before and after. So this mainstreaming, and not mainstreaming as we usually think of going into the dominant culture, but mainstreaming in terms of bringing gender into the movements themselves has been going on. Probably the other instance that's really important that I've seen lately has been the resistance since the coup in Honduras, where a group called Feministas en Resistencia, Feminists in Resistance from the very beginning, came out with marching as feminists, demanding an end to the coup, which was rolling back significantly, practically overnight, a lot of the gains, the small gains that they've been able to make within their country, with slogans like no al golpe del Estado, ni golpes contra la mujer. No coup d'etat, which is called a golpe or a hit or a strike, or strikes against women. Always, always, always having those gender issues as part of the overall movement. So first of all, this is just a few notes about what we're talking about when we talk about capitalism, because we're talking about, and this is some things that we've been talking about during this conference, we're talking about an economic system, obviously, and most people have a good grounding in what that means, although in some senses, as we've noted, theoretically, we're a little behind in terms of how capitalism is involved in understanding all the impacts that has on us, and how it's survived and adapted to its many crises, and probably will continue to do so, because I'm not one of those who thinks that it's on its last leg necessarily, unfortunately. And the second is as a political system, and there we've talked about the role of the state, the role of the state in sometimes poorly administrating capitalism, and an ambivalent role of the state. We want it, yet we don't want it. And there again, I think it's an exaggeration to say that the state is withering or becoming obsolete under capitalism. What we see in Mexico, when we look, for example, at the amount of money that the state puts into supporting transnational corporations, the richest entities on the planet, the amount of subsidies when campesinos are starving that go to Monsanto and Cargill from the Mexican government, we see that the state continues to play a major role, not just in setting the regulations which continue to be done by nation states, even in multilateral organisms, but also in directly financing and assuring that wealth is distributed upward in a continuous manner. And we also see that it's a system of human relations. And this is, I think, what's going to be important to us here in this discussion about gender. Because when we see it as a system of human relations, where there's certain types of relations of power and of values and the way that economic relationships permeate our personal relationships, this has a lot to do with gender. And in this we have commodification, and of course patriarchy, the way that patriarchy upholds capitalism and vice versa. And we're seeing some changes in that relationship and in those forms as we see these changes in the forms of capitalism itself. I think one of the things, at least for me, is spending time in Cuba has been most interesting is precisely this, to see forms of human relationship that are not mediated constantly almost by money. And it's striking, and I heard many stories too, though, where people, try to, as people go into people's houses, with this new thing where you stay in people's houses, where they go in and they say, oh, here, we make these beans, and they go, how much do I owe you? And the Cubans would say, what are you talking about? What's wrong with you people, So it's that kind of thing that it's almost hard for us to conceive of, having grown up in this system, just how deeply that goes. Except if you fly on an airplane and you realize that they will no longer give you even a glass of water on some flights now, if they think that they can charge you for it. But anyway. And then the last, I think it's really important as we look at this current stage, is this savage or this predatory stage of capitalism that we're looking at now, that's based on a heightened competition for resources that are becoming increasingly limited. And that's created this offensive against communities, this increase in extractivism, we call it, which is like mining, extracting resources from the earth, mining, mega developments in terms of hydroelectric dams. When we get together the human rights defenders in the area of Mesoamerica especially, almost all of them, and particularly the indigenous and rural women, are working on issues that have to do with defense of land and territory while simultaneously working on defense of human rights and women's rights. So this has put us in a situation, I guess you can probably go on to the next one. In a contradictory situation that again brings up the old cliche of how crises create opportunities. In terms of the crisis, a friend of mine, Raquel Gutierrez, calls it a transition from accumulation along a colonial developmentist kind of limited model that was in our region of the world often imposed by military dictatorships, to a neoliberal colonial model with apparent democracy. So this has obviously created very new challenges for us, because, and in some ways, it's easier not to live under a military dictatorship. You don't fear for your life as much. There's some liberties, social liberties or civil liberties that you can enjoy that you wouldn't otherwise. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious advantages of not living under a military dictatorship, but the new challenges have to do with oftentimes the issues aren't so clear. And especially in the apparent democracy, when you have democracy defined as your ability to vote then you come face to face to citizenry that believes that if I vote, I've dispensed with my obligations as a member of a democratic society, and although they may complain about what a clearly not very representative ruling elite, political elite does, there's still a level of demobilization on the grassroots. Or at times, people who decide to go into party politics have had very mixed results. There are times, clearly, when we look at center-left governments in Latin America, where they've been able to advance by gaining power and then changing, modifying some of the terms of capitalism, not all of them obviously, not the complete model. But there are other times when a huge amount of social energy has gone into the construction of parties and been co-opted or disappointed or repressed through fraud or repressed outright through assassinations and other forms, and it's been a tremendous loss in terms of movement building from the bottom that would be capable of creating alternative spaces and confronting the state in more profound ways. The other thing that we're seeing is militarism, and I put here, a word is because so much of it is, in Mexico and Mesoamerica, under the war on drugs, it's been militarized. And we did, with the Nobel Women's Initiative delegation, and been working this issue for a long time, how does that affect women? And while women aren't the majority of the people assassinated, which are now 100,000 people here in Mexico, since 2007, when the war on drugs was launched, which is a lot, and none of those cases hardly are investigated or anything, not to mention another 26,000 disappeared at least. Anyway, not the majority, as in any war, are not necessarily women, but are not women. But the majority of people who are standing up for justice in the cases of those assassinations, who are looking for members that disappeared, are women. And so they are putting themselves at risk, but they're also creating new types of movements, which you'll see in a minute is a real opportunity for us here too. We've also seen a rise in fundamentalism, and this is a religious backlash. That's a response to the insecurity that we see, not just the physical insecurity of the drug war here, but also the economic insecurity in the United States, which has been a challenge to feminism. A rise in racism and xenophobia for much the same reasons as we've seen recently in the unaccompanied minor crisis in the United States, the way that's been used to trigger, ironically, an anti-migrant backlash in the context of political and economic changes. And then just very quickly, this is against a background of impunity, which means a lack of access to justice, which affects women even more than men because you have the added factor of discrimination. A woman goes to the police and says, my daughter's disappeared, do something, and she's desperate, as you would be as a mother. And first of all, she gets a reaction that a man would get, that the police is actually in collusion with the person who's kidnapped her daughter, and so he's obviously not going to do anything. But also you get these sexist responses like, why don't you go back to the kitchen, or your daughter probably just ran off with her boyfriend, or she's probably involved in something, a whole layer, and then of course if it's an indigenous woman, you have another layer of discrimination as well. This is just a picture from Ciudad Juarez, where, just to give you an example of how this overall context of violence and militarization being, extreme form of patriarchy, has led to almost 3 times the rate of already high femicides that we were seeing in Ciudad Juarez before the war on drugs and this militarized strategy of sending the armed forces to do domestic crime fighting came out. Now I want to just quickly, before ending, because it's almost time, this is like why women? Why are women important in moving beyond capitalism? A few of the questions that Trish was talking about. And first of all, it's the no sentientas. We're not talking about the radical feminist argument that women, biologically as women, are more pure, are more centered, are more connected to the earth for being reproducers. I mean, that's not the kind of argument we're talking about, but it has a lot of similarities. Because for biological and social reasons that have developed over time, the women are the ones who are more connected to the family sphere, they're more connected to the private sphere, they're more connected to a care economy that's becoming more and more important as one of those spaces that we talked about that in many ways functions outside of capitalism. And here, although I'm running out of time, it's really important to just say one thing about family. You know, we went through an analysis and a critique of family according to the lines of Engels, and I think that critique was right. The way that it functions to hold up capitalism and to hold up patriarchy. But what we saw is that then, as a feminist movement in the 70s and 80s, going against family as a place where women were oppressed and as a model for the patriarchal oppression of women in society, there was a huge backlash. And we lost. It stung hard. And what we realized is that family, as capitalism progressed in making human relationships, dehumanizing human relationships, that family was the last refuge. And that's what people were responding to, and we didn't understand that at first. And as people responded to that one place where relationships were based on love for each other, not what you were going to get out of it, you know, where the care economy existed in such a way that women cared for other people because they cared about other people, you know, in this whole different set of values, we failed to realize, you know, how much that would hurt society by frontally attacking it. And now we've come a long way because we've been able to at least expand the definition of family. But we have to understand now that we're in a different moment, and while those critiques are valid, the family has become a unit of resistance in many societies, in the United States to a certain degree, but we especially see it in the indigenous communities, where there's defense of territory, where the community serves as an expansion of the concept of family, and that's where you see women on the front line as well. Okay, well, to finish up then, this is like a woman who, Donde Están, where the disappeared movement. In the movement for peace, justice, and dignity, of the data we've looked at, there's about 67% of the cases of people who are looking for loved one are women. And some have been killed for it. And the next. Okay, this is just quickly some of the strategies. This has been Mujeres Sombra, but that was a different it's the same strategies. The building networks. We now have a network of women human rights defenders in Mesoamerica, as well as national networks in Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, creating spaces and community and autonomous communities of women. And that, of course, would be the Zapatistas, places where they can begin to take roles that they haven't been able to take in the dominant society. Fortifying leadership. We have a school, the Feminist Leadership School for rural and indigenous women that we run on the level of Mesoamerica. Uniting the defense of rights with protest, resistance, and the creation of alternatives. And this is important because when you get just into women's rights and human rights, you're up against state institutions that, in our case, especially Mexico and other countries, are so corrupt and so intransigent that it becomes, again, this huge drain. And also you're often up against trying to supposedly improve the same institutions that are actively repressing you or that are in active complicity with organized crime groups and others. So it becomes a huge contradiction, trying to get protection from a state that's actively working the other direction. And then, of course, these spaces that need to be also considered, which are self-care, the defender's security, the women's security itself, communication, and how to handle the fear and the trauma that's come along with what's happening to us now. In other words, if we don't care for ourselves in this process, we can't continue to do the work and we can't build movements. And then finally, these projects to what they call in Spanish, reconstruct the social fabric, to rebuild community so that we can go on. So I'll leave it there for questions. Thank you.
I am sure we have a ton of questions. Let's just go for two so we can move on to Peggy. Okay, we'll hold until the end.